What's your ultimate nightmare? Is it being trapped in the dark? Is it the feeling of being in a space so tight you can't even take a full breath? What if you were buried, alive, with tons of rock sealing you in? Today we're looking at 3 stories where that nightmare became a horrifying reality. Now, a heads up, these stories are intense and they are all true. So viewer discretion is definitely advised. Our first story is just one of the most hair-raising, reckless nights you can possibly imagine. It's a night that left one man broken and trapped, fighting just to stay alive. It was a chilly evening, December 21st, 1997, in Arizona. A group of young guys, Brandon Silverhorn, Christopher Reed, Gus Hansen, John Salazar, and Jeremy Platt, decided to go out to the Safford Shafts, a desolate area also known as Red Nests. This was not your typical hangout spot. It's a landscape of deep pits dropping 40 to 60 feet down, carved into the hardened bed of an ancient lake. One pit in particular was capped by a thick, 4-foot layer of rock covering 60 feet of silt. A strange place for an adventure, but it's exactly what they were looking for. They got there around 9 p.m., armed with gasoline and some truly questionable ideas. You'd think that standing near these sheer drops would make them cautious, but no. They were drawn to a narrow fissure in the rock, barely a foot wide. Their plan? To turn this crack into a fiery spectacle. They poured about 4 gallons of gasoline down into it. 4 gallons. And then they lit a gas-soaked rag and tossed it into the abyss. For just a moment, there was silence, and then chaos. The ground literally blew apart. Fire and debris shot into the air like some kind of hellish geyser. That narrow crack widened in an instant, turning into a gaping hole. The force of the blast threw 4 of the men backward, leaving them bruised and disoriented. But Brandon Silverhorn? He wasn't so lucky. Brandon was standing too close to the edge, peeking down when the explosion hit. His feet were knocked out from under him. He rolled over and plummeted straight into the pit, vanishing into the earth. A 40-foot drop, straight down into a tilted crevice. The landing was brutal. His leg hit first, and you can just imagine the sickening snap as it broke. He slid further into the crevice, his body twisting, and then rocks and dirt poured in after him, pinning him in place. And then the real horror. A massive slab of rock, 3 feet by 5 feet, slid down and landed on top of it all. It buried him, sealing him in like a grave. His friends scrambled to the edge, yelling his name, but the dust and smoke made it impossible to see. Let me try to paint this picture for you. Brandon was wedged in this crevice, his body at an unnatural angle. His head was forced sideways against the rock, his broken leg was screaming with pain, and the immense pressure of it all was straining his kidneys and abdomen, making every breath painful. That slab of rock was a coffin lid, sealing him in. The dust was so thick it choked him, making it nearly impossible to even cry out. The panic that gripped the other men must have been unbearable. They kept shouting his name, but there was no response. A self-rescue was impossible. Knowing they couldn't do anything, they scrambled to their car and raced back to town for help. Rescuers were there within the hour, and when they saw the scene, they knew this was going to be a long, dangerous night. The first thing they saw was that slab of rock covering Brandon. It wasn't just heavy, it was wedged into the crevice like it was part of the earth. Hours had passed, and Brandon's situation made the rescuers question if he could even still be alive. They rigged a tripod over the chasm and assessed the scene. Meanwhile, Brandon was enduring the unimaginable. He was trapped, broken, and battered under layers of rock and dirt. The cold was relentless, just leaching the warmth from his body. Hours passed, each one a test of his will to survive. The first task was removing that massive slab. Rescuers began slowly chiseling away at its edges to loosen it. It was slow, grueling work. Every strike of the chisel sent more debris tumbling down. Once they had enough clearance, they secured a pulley system over the tripod and attached ropes to the rock. It took the combined strength of 6 men, pulling with everything they had to lift that slab inch by inch. Finally, with one last heave, they shifted it out of the way. With the slab gone, the digging began. Rescuers worked carefully, removing rocks and dirt by hand. Every move was deliberate, trying not to cause more injury. By now, Brandon's body was numb with cold. The dust had caked his throat, and he was drifting in and out of consciousness. The pain and hypothermia were waging a war on his body. Then, after hours of painstaking effort, they reached him. They were absolutely stunned to find him alive. By all accounts, Brandon should have been dead, crushed, suffocated, or succumbed to his injuries long ago. But there he was, breathing. The final stage was securing him with ropes. They carefully maneuvered a harness around his limp body, immobilizing his broken leg. The rescuers worked methodically, pulling him out slowly. At last, after nearly 12 excruciating hours, Brandon was lifted out of that pit. The sight of him was sobering. His leg was grotesquely swollen, his body was ice cold, his breathing shallow. He was rushed to the hospital, where doctors found he had a broken leg, kidney failure, and severe hypothermia. It was an absolute miracle that he survived. Looking back on this, it is hard not to just marvel at the sheer lack of judgment. Pouring gasoline into a fissure and lighting it? It's the kind of thing you expect in a cautionary tale, not real life. The consequences were devastating, but in a way, they were lucky. Brandon survived. This next story is a perfect example of how, in these cave systems, you have to be cautious right up until the very last minute. It was February 1994 on a Caribbean island. You know the scene. Warm beaches, blue skies, total peace. David Parks and his buddy Jerry were on vacation, living that dream. That's when they heard from locals about a deep, mysterious cave with a pool inside. The kind of thing you don't think twice about exploring when you're in paradise. They weren't experienced cavers or divers, but that didn't seem to matter. They grabbed snorkeling gear, a couple of diving lights, and went off to find their adventure. When they found the cave, it was more intimidating than they expected. A vertical shaft, 70 feet straight down. But they didn't hesitate. They climbed down, gripping the damp walls, each step taking them further into the dark. At the bottom, the space opened into a chamber, and in the middle was the pool. It looked calm, but it had that spooky stillness that comes with deep, dark water. What they didn't know was this pool was connected to narrow underwater tunnels, passages that threaded through the cave with only small air pockets scattered along the way. To them, this was just exciting. They slipped into the water, the cold shocking their skin. With their lights slicing through the darkness, they swam into the first tunnel, surfacing now and then in the air pockets. After a while, they surfaced in a much larger cavern. This room felt massive. There was a small rock ledge where they could rest, and they just sat there, taking it all in. But then it hit them. They were deep inside this cave, far from an easy exit. It was time to head back. David took the lead. At first, everything seemed fine, but then things took a turn. Their movements kicked up silt from the bottom, turning the clear water into a thick, milky mess. In seconds, visibility dropped to 0. It was like trying to find your way through a blizzard. Somewhere in the chaos, David lost Jerry. He turned, trying to find him, but it was useless. Worse, he completely lost his sense of direction. The tunnels all looked the same, and the silt made it impossible to tell which way was out. Panic started to creep in, his chest tightening as his lungs burned. He realized he was swimming deeper into the cave, not out. He couldn't see, he couldn't breathe, and the silence was deafening. Just when he thought he was done, that he couldn't hold his breath for one more second, his hand broke the surface of an air pocket. He shot up too fast, smashing his head on a stalactite. The pain was sharp, but he barely noticed, overshadowed by the sheer relief of breathing. The air pocket was tiny, the ceiling pressing down on him like a coffin lid. He clung to a narrow rock shelf, gasping the stale air. Meanwhile, Jerry had actually made it back to the entrance. He surfaced and waited, expecting David to follow. But minutes passed. Panic set in.
He started shouting into the water, shining his light into the tunnel. Back in that tiny air pocket, David knew he couldn't stay. The air wasn't good, and he was out of options. He put his mask on, submerged himself, and turned off his own light. Why? He was hoping, just maybe, he could spot the glimmer of Jerry's light through the murk. And then he saw it, a faint glow, so dim it was barely there, but it was something. Taking the deepest breath he could, he pushed off the rock shelf and swam toward it. His lungs were screaming as he moved, his body on the edge of giving out. Finally, his head broke the surface, and he was greeted by the blinding beam of Jerry's dive light. He made it.
Exhausted and shaking, he clung to the edge of the pool as Jerry pulled him out. They climbed out of the water and back up that 70-foot shaft. When they finally emerged into the sunlight, it felt like breaking free from a nightmare. Later, they shared their story with experienced divers who told them just how lucky they'd been. Those air pockets they relied on, they don't always contain breathable air. And that silt they stirred up, it could have stayed suspended for days, making it impossible to find the way out. David and Jerry survived, but they knew it so easily could have gone the other way. The earth doesn't care about your plans. If you're not prepared, it will swallow you whole. These stories are just intense. It really makes you think about how quickly things can go wrong. And that brings me to the question for you all. What's the most beautiful, but also slightly terrifying, natural place you've ever been? Let me know in the comments. And if you're finding these stories as gripping as I am, do me a favor and hit that like button. It's a small click, but it really helps our Motomate community grow. Now, you might have heard geologists say that one of the safest places to be during an earthquake is inside a cave. That may be true, but this caving nightmare tells a very different story. It was Memorial Day weekend, 1980. A team from the Mother Lode Grotto set out to explore Church Cave in Kings Canyon National Park. The group, Dave Cowan, Paul Graves, Jack Espana, Bob Pine, and Eric Popoff, was experienced, maybe even a little overconfident. They weren't rookies, but as you're about to see, no amount of preparation can match what nature can throw at you. They started their trek in the morning, hiking up steep, rugged paths. Spirits were high. You know how it is, laughing and joking, imagining the adventure waiting underground. By the time they reached Church Cave around 9:30 a.m., the excitement was electric. Descending into the cave, they felt that rush you only get when you step into a world that doesn't feel like it should exist. The air gets cooler, and the sound of your own breath echoes back at you. They rappelled down into the first section and found themselves in a chamber, a tight space. The kind that makes you feel like the earth is giving you a hug, but not the comforting kind. The walls seemed to press in. And that's when it happened, a deep rumble. It wasn't like anything they'd felt before. The ground beneath them shuddered, and the cave roared like a living thing. A 6.0 earthquake had just struck. I can't imagine the terror they must have felt clinging to the walls as the world shifted around them. Dust filled the air, rocks loosened and tumbled, and the ceiling creaked like it was about to come down. When the shaking finally stopped, there was this eerie silence. Their hearts must have been pounding. They were alive, but they were not out of danger. They knew they had to get out fast. Aftershocks were practically guaranteed. As they started their climb back, the situation went from bad to worse. Barely 20 minutes later, a 5.7 aftershock hit. The ground groaned, and rocks from the canyon above began raining down. Let me tell you, being underground during an earthquake is a completely different beast. Every vibration feels amplified, like the earth is trying to swallow you whole. The group pressed on, reaching a section known, ominously, as the torture chamber. If a part of a cave has a name like that, you know it's not fun. It was a steep, narrow chute they had to climb up. Slow, careful work. One by one they started. Jack Espana was leading the climb when the worst happened. Another massive quake, a second 6.0 hit. The cave came alive, shaking violently.
Jack lost his grip. He fell, slamming into the rock, and came to a sudden stop, wedged tightly between two boulders. Meanwhile, the rest of the group was fighting just to stay upright. Jack was screaming, his voice echoing, trapped, unable to move. Below him, the team was scrambling for footing. When the shaking stopped, the others rushed to help. It took ropes, coordination, and sheer will to pull Jack free. He was banged up, bruised, and shaken, probably questioning every decision that led him there. But there was no time to dwell on it. They had to keep moving. As they neared the entrance, the earth trembled again and again. Aftershocks kept them on edge, forcing them to freeze, hugging the cold rock, praying the walls wouldn't collapse. Finally, after what must have felt like a nightmare, they saw it, daylight, that faint, blessed glow of freedom. They staggered out, battered and bloody, but alive. As they exited, the earth gave one last 5.7 shake, sending more rocks tumbling down behind them. They had made it. Just barely. Church Cave didn't collapse that day, but it came close. And those men, they carried the marks of that day with them, not just the physical scars, but the memory of just how close they came to being buried alive. Thanks for watching. If you want to see more incredible true stories, be sure to subscribe to Motivate so you don't miss the next one. Stay safe out there.